Today, we're going to look at early American foreign policy under Presidents George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Foreign policy is a policy pursued by a nation in its dealings with other nations designed to achieve national objectives. George Washington's primary foreign policy was neutrality. In 1793, he issued his Neutrality Proclamation. The problem that Washington had was that Great Britain and France during this time period were constantly going to war with each other. Washington's goal was to keep the United States out of war, be neutral. But Britain began to seize American ships on the open oceans. Jay's Treaty prevented war and promoted trade with Britain. It also limited France's access to American ports. So Jay's Treaty allowed the United States to make money in trading with Great Britain. When John Adams became president in 1797, France was seizing United States ships. The United States wanted to sign a treaty to prevent war. But France demanded that the United States pay them money to sign this treaty. The United States refused. Their philosophy, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This meant that the United States would pay to build up its defenses, but not pay to sign a treaty with France. The United States used this event as a reason to build up the Navy. France eventually backed down, and Adams avoided war. After Thomas Jefferson became president, he had the opportunity to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France. In 1803, he did so, doubling the size of the United States and gaining the port of New Orleans for United States commerce. Like previous presidents, Jefferson had to deal with Britain and France capturing American ships. Not wanting to go to war, he proposed the Embargo Act of 1807. This embargo, which is the banning of trade with other countries, was supposed to hurt Britain and France economically, but the only effect it had was devastating the United States economy. Here's a chart showing the effect the embargo had on United States commerce. In the year 1807, you can see how high the value of imports were and how high the value of exports were. But by the following year, after the embargo had been put in place, you can see how much exports had dropped, and you can see how much imports had dropped. The Embargo Act ended in 1809, but it did a great deal of damage to the United States economy. Here you see a political cartoon that was published in a United States newspaper. You see the word embargo written on the side of a turtle, and what that symbolized was that the United States commerce was moving at the same speed as a turtle would move, very, very slowly. When James Madison became president, he also had to deal with problems with Britain. These problems eventually led to the War of 1812. And if you remember, the primary causes of the War of 1812 were the impressment of American sailors, Britain arming American Indians, and the American invasion of Canada. The War of 1812 lasted until 1814 and ended with the Treaty of Ghent. The war was basically a tie, but it had a huge impact on the United States. Not only did it create a sense of pride and nationalism, it caused countries around the world to realize the United States was now an established country. One of the nationalistic things that came out of the War of 1812 was the writing of our national anthem by Francis Scott Key. When James Monroe became president in 1817, Many countries in Central and South America had achieved independence from Spain. In order to make sure European countries did not interfere with his independence process, he issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Monroe saw the United States as a model and protector of countries in Central and South America. Here you see a political cartoon of the United States protecting the Western Hemisphere. So let's review. Foreign policy is a policy pursued by a nation in its dealings with other nations designed to achieve national objectives. The foreign policy of our first president, George Washington, was to keep the United States out of war, and he did this through issuing the Neutrality Proclamation. John Adams' foreign policy was refusing to give France money to sign a treaty, strengthening the United States Navy, and keeping the United States out of war. Thomas Jefferson, as president, bought the Louisiana Territory and unfortunately pushed through the Embargo Act, which damaged the United States economy. James Madison was president of the United States during the War of 1812. And as you recall, the War of 1812 was basically a tie. But from this war, the United States gained a sense of pride and nationalism, and it also caused countries throughout the world to realize that the United States was now a legitimate country. Finally, James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European nations to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. So the importance of what we just covered was that the foreign policies of the early presidents of the United States allowed the country to develop and eventually be recognized by other countries as a legitimate, free nation.